about class component in React. So here we discussed about what are the changes in class component. So a class component can be derived from two base classes. One is React component, React pure component. We will apply such React pure components in routing and all. We will see what is difference, because in React interviews this question is common, like what is a pure component and what is impure component. So a pure component will update only the changes, but impure component will mount, reload everything, even a small change occurred. That means only changes are reloaded in pure component. Entire component is reloaded when changes occurred, any one change occurred. That is what the component impure, we call them as impure. So another, we discussed about state. State is inbuilt. That means state is a built-in feature. Already state is configured. We have to just use the state. There is no need of using the external hooks, and hooks are not allowed in class. So state is inbuilt. It is used as an object, and you can access and use that object. Next, we discussed the change is about how you configure mount. So we have a option called component did mount. Component did mount is a function which defines actions to perform when component is mounted. So when component mounted, we can define certain actions. Here one more question is there. Generally, component mount is same like use effect. In our function components, we have use effect. In class component, we have component did mount. In interview, one question asked is, we have a constructor. Constructor also automatically executes at the time of creating an object. Why can't we write anything in constructor? Why to write in mount? Question understood? You want certain actions to perform at the time of loading component. Then in constructor you can write. Why to write in mount? Because you see here, suppose, so we are trying to fetch some data. We are trying to fetch some data first. Suppose C, we will try to fetch some data. Just I will give an option here. Yeah. So we are trying to fetch some data and display. Suppose there is categories, state, it is an array. Categories is an array. What we are doing is, this is constructor. This is the constructor. In the constructor, I'm using a fetch method. I'm fetching from http fakestore api.com/products/categories and dot then. So dot then we are using a callback response and return response dot json. and dot then. So we have the categories. We read every category and set into this dot what set state. Set state, what is that? Categories. Into the categories we are assigning these categories. The categories we are assigning these categories. That means categories is the data we are having. Suppose we have an ordered list, and here we are writing this dot state dot what categories dot map. So we read every category and we create a list item. Key is category and the value is category. So we defined in the constructor the functionality of loading all the content and displaying. It is working. Then why to use a mount? In function there will be no constructor, so we have to use effect. In a function there is no constructor, so you have to use an use effect. In a class you have a constructor, then why again you need a mount phase? Now question understood? So you can answer that if you know about perfectly about constructors, right? What do you know about constructors? What are the rules about constructors? Restriction about constructors? You know constructor subroutine can execute only once per an object. Na? A constructor is a subroutine. Can it execute again for an object? Every constructor execute only once for an object. In that case, you see here it is working fine. But when you inspect and you look into the console, it shows an error. It says cannot call set state that is not yet mounted. So that means your application is having a bug. It is not an error. Bug means it is a technical issue which may lead to more issues in future. It is not an error to stop you. It will work in different situations but fail in different situations. What is bug? So bug means when you are using an application, suddenly some issue comes. And that issue may not be every time. At a certain phase, at a certain fast functionality, you may face it. In other situations, it may work fine. So it is not recommended if it can create a bug. If it is an error, we avoid every time. If it is a bug, then that also we don't prefer much. So here that is another question for experienced people. They ask like, why can't we write actions to perform? Actions to perform while creating instance for constructor for component. That means so actions in constructor. Creating instance means the job of creating instance is done by constructor. So is the issue is constructor is a special type of subroutine that executes only once per object. It cannot assign new values on change. So it setting state
अब तो
in
खुल गया दुकान
constructor
तो क्या हाल है? सेल गिर गया।
at the
बोल
time
सिग्नल
of
खुला ना पा।
initializing state will lead to bug. So this is the important
यही सिस्टम। अरे
actions to perform while creating an instance for component.
और ये का पप्पू अंकल का भी बाल बच्चे एकदम बड़ा बड़ा है ना पापा।
It's a special type of subroutine
अच्छा।
that executes only one per
और
object.
इधर का भी था अपार्टमेंट का भी दो चार लड़का था। दोस्त लोग को बुलाए।
That is the options. So it will
फिर वो
work.
भी लड़का था जो कम्मा कर रहा था।
So there is no
जो काम
problem in
करता
that.
था
So
वो भी
it's
लड़का
going
था।
to work. But the
पतला
issue
दुबला कौन
is
लड़का था? हाँ
it
वही लड़का
cannot
था।
update your details because constructor executes only once.
तीन
So
भाई
hence it
दो
is
भाई।
always recommended to define
हाँ वही
in
लोग
mount.
फिर आया पप्पू और ये।
So as per the
ना
rules,
बेटा ना भाई सब।
it is
दीपा
not
वाला दिखा।
recommended
हाँ?
to set state
तो
before
ना देता है क्या
mounting
कुछ?
of component.
आया हुआ था ना?
Always it is recommended after mounting. It is not recommended to set
हाँ
state
ना।
before mounting a component. Before mounting a component. So that is the constructor.
फिकवा कहाँ जाएगा? तो भाई का शादी हो रहा है।
So we have to always write in a mount phase. There are several phases. We will discuss in another concept, life cycle, how it works. Next, important, while working with components, I told you about events. What is new about events? Events in a class component. Already few points we discussed there. Detailedly one more concept I will tell you. Events in class component. What is difference is actually all events are synthetic events. Synthetic events. That means what you have used in function components, same will work in class component. But what is difference here? In class component, events map to methods. Event map to methods, not to functions. Generally, in function component, event map to functions. Here, event will map to methods. So that means what we do? So we define a method, handle name change. And here we have to put a button on click so of say text box, suppose input type text on change is equal to this dot handle name chain. It will map to the methods, not to functions. So the actions are mapped to the methods.
आप रुकिएगा तब ना।
Now here one key
आप
point is
रुकिएगा
that
तब ना देखिएगा।
actually
हम आए, मैं पीछे पीछे आप आए, रुके कहाँ?
if
हम जूता खोला, आप पहुंचे हैं।
the event methods
सवा दस।
are using state, if any event
सुभान भाई
action
को तो देखा।
is using state, then the component will reject it. Component is unable to handle.
हम ही लोग
That
रहे हैं।
means the
4 5 छोड़े हैं,
event
वो भी देख के सोच
methods
रहा साला सब सही में पहुंच गया।
can
तो
directly
देखा
use
एक
all
को
DOM
देखे 6
manipulation,
आदमी पहुंच गए हम लोग।
but they cannot handle state.
बउआ का है ना
Why they
रखिएगा।
cannot handle state? Because state is initialized at the time of creating component, and that state
है
you
उन
are
लोग को
trying
दे दी
to
जाएगी।
use after creating component.
ना।
Then
हाँ, ये
the
मसला ना,
methods
मसला है
which
कि
are created
मुंडी
after
ज्यादा देखे तो
creating a
आदमी को लगेगा कि
component,
अरे साला
they cannot use the state because state is created in the constructor at the time of construction, and the methods cannot penetrate into the constructor. They cannot access the state in the
और
constructor.
पापा अंकल अकेले करते बिजनेस
That
तो
is the
वही करना
reason
पड़ता।
at the time of constructing itself, we have
तुम्हें
to
लगा ये
register
बोल रहे हो।
these methods if you want to
आवाज
use
दिया 201।
state. You know, for example, you have installed a software.
ना ठीक है दिया।
After installing software, that software is not ready to use. Do you know why? It will ask to restart your computer.
वो का तो हेलीकॉप्टर से आया था।
Why I should restart a computer? To use the software that I recently installed. What is the reason behind it? That is the same reason here also. What is the reason? When a software is installed, after you load the operating system, that software related files cannot be copied into Windows registry. Operating system have a registry. Registry allows files to be copied into it only at the time of loading, booting.
ये तो गोल छू लीजिए आओ का।
After loading, registry will not allow anything inside. So that is the reason the new software that you installed cannot be used. It is not ready to use. When you restart, the new files will be copied into the registry, because when restart, it is rebooting, the new files are copied into registry, and next on restart, it is available to use. The same thing happens here. At the time of constructing a component, a state is registered, and that state is trying to be used by the methods which are created after state is registered. It's not possible. Then you have to make sure that your methods also registered at the time of construction. At the time of construction only they are registered. They are bind with the class and its memory. Then these methods can use the state. So what is the point here is, so methods defined for events cannot use state. They cannot use state. So you have to register every method. You have to register every method. Register every method at the time of at the time of constructing a component. At the time of constructing a component, and bind with the class memory so that it can use the state. So that it can use the state. This is important. So if a method is defined, if a method is defined and you are using a method, if a method is defined and you are using a method without state, it will work. But if it is trying to use state, it cannot. So actually, to do this, React provides bind method to bind the actions with current class state, with current class state. So what you have to do is you have to define this. There are so many points. Actually, this bind allows you to register with the class memory. It allows you to register with the class memory. Then it can use it. For example, suppose now here, this is not required. This is just the concept of, yeah, how we write in a constructor. So here, suppose we are having a state and we are defining, this is like, so name, and we have like some age, something like this we are having. Now we are creating a simple data list, data term, name, input type is text, and another data term is age. So input type is equal to number. Okay. Now we want to collect the details. So here I will keep just register, and we will keep another paragraph, some name. We want to access this dot state dot name and age. So here we defined this dot, so state dot age. Okay. Now we need to access the data from, we need to access the data from these text boxes and display. Then we need to write a change event for them. We need to define a change event. So see what we are doing here. So we will write a method, handle name change. And this is going to collect the event arguments. Events arguments all are same. There is no change in this. So here we have to this dot set state. Into that we have an name, and into name e dot target dot value. That's what we are setting it. Similarly, handle. So that is age change. So age change. And in age change, this dot set state, and we have age, that is e dot target dot value. We are accessing it this way. And suppose, what about age? This dot state dot age. What about name? This dot state dot name. We know what will happen if you don't do that. Huh? Already we learned this. Now we are trying to use the state. Now when I click inside and try to use the state, and we have to bind with these two. That means on change. On change, this dot handle name change, and on change, this dot handle age change. Now you see here I am trying to type, it shows an error. What is the error here is, the error indicates that so cannot read properties of an undefined set state. So what is the problem is, it is unable to use the state. It is unable to set the state. So why? Because this event is actually created after the component is created, and the state is configured at the time of creating component. Is it possible to configure state outside constructor? It's not possible. State must be initialized at the time of creating a component. There is no chance that you can configure outside. It's not possible. So we have to define here. Then how the state and your method both can be registered with class memory. So what we have to do is, at the time of construction itself, make sure that this method is registered with your class. How you make the method registered with the class? First, define the method which you want to register. So this dot handle name change. How we register? So this dot handle name change, it will bind with what? This. That means the current method is binded with the current class memory, and it is returned. This return name can be anything. It can be different, but usually we maintain same name. That means which method registered, that method returned. If you can have a return name different, register name different, but it will mess up your logic. Anyway, doesn't matter. That means you have to bind and store in a reference. That reference you have to use. So that means you are binding this method with the current class memory and returning it. That means at the time of constructing the component, the state is registered, and your method also registered. Once your method also registered, then the method can use state. Only this method can use state. Only this method can use state. Others cannot. That means age cannot use. Now see here, I will click and I am typing something here. It is working. And how about age now? I enter age, it shows again error because age is not registered. That means every event that you write in class component, if it is using state, then you have to register. You have to register by using which method? Bind. That's a lengthy concept. So that is how we need to manage. There are different techniques actually, but all techniques are same concept. Without registering in the constructor, because I told you in the beginning itself, in the introduction, the features of and the challenges in modern generation of web development. I told you loosely coupled extensible architecture, simplified deployment, if you remembered those points. That means any new feature must able to easily plug in. That is the one of the main reason we are using single page applications, so that they can easily plug in. So here you see now what we can do is, here the name change, here directly we can use a bind method. I'm using bind method for this, and you see now I entered name, it's fine. Age, it's not working because bind with whom? Bind with the current class memory. That means it should bind with which one? This. That means the current, this refers to the current class object. That means now here I am entering the name and here I am entering the age. It is fine. It is not mandatory that you have to configure in the construct. Now what is difference? Writing in constructor and using here, because bind is used to penetrate into the constructor and register your method. And then what is difference between writing in constructor and configuring here? They implement two mechanisms. We call it as eager loading, lazy loading. What is eager loading is, if you are writing in a constructor, all your methods are registered at the time of constructing a component, even if you are not using them. Why I need them? That means if it is mandatory that every method that you configured you are going to use, then you can define in a construct. But if you are not sure about the actions every time to be used, then better use another technique. What is the second technique? It will be registered only when it is used. The previous one, it is registered even when it is not in use. We call this mechanism as eager loading, lazy loading. You want lazy load, that means use only when it is needed. Then you can approach with this. We can define this. So here there are two techniques. So first one is you can bind the method using eager loading approach. That means in constructor we have to configure this dot handle name dot bind, just syntax I'm giving, bind with this. So this dot handle age dot bind this. Like this you can configure. So that is one approach. So you can bind the method using lazy loading approach. So it is nothing but it binds only when it is used. That's what lazy loading approach is. And how do we define this? In the direct element itself, on change. So this dot handle name dot bind this. Is it mandatory to bind every event? No. It is necessary only when that event is using state. If event is not using state, you don't need, because any DOM methods, DOM manipulations, other interactions, then you don't need. Only if it is using state, then you can configure it. Now, here in some of the experience interviews, they ask like, without bind method, can we manage? Is it necessary that I should use bind? Is there any another technique without bind? For that, you need to learn some more points of cycle. You can handle that. But usually, see here, suppose without this bind, here, how do you configure is? We define like a function. That means this is an function. And what this is doing, this function is returning this dot handle age change. This dot handle age change. This not done, just I am giving some points. What is this approach? This is function. It is a function. What is difference between a function and a method? So function call, yeah, it is using a function call, yeah. What is difference between a function? Here we are using name and here we are using age. You see, it is not working because still it has some points you need to know. Now, this technique is used. This technique is used. Actually, later you will implement this technique with some more changes. Cycle we will learn, we can understand. What is this technique is function. What is meant by function? The means in general, what is difference between a method and a function? Technical means not in JavaScript it is a valid every time. Not in JavaScript it is valid every time. This is representing void. Am I right? This is representing void. This is an void one, void function. How we can make it return? If you remove this block, then it becomes return. That means now it is not void anymore. So it will return this one. It will return this one. Handle change is this. Now, what is this concept is you are defining some values. What are those values? This will return this value, and that value can be used by the events. So that means generally what is meant by function? Function means usually technically function always returns a value. Function always returns a value. So function is going to always return a value. So if it is always going to return a value, then you can access the return value and assign it to the class. That approach we will learn after the cycle, means component cycle will be there. We will discuss about that. So if anyone asks like without bind method also, is it possible to bind? It is possible to bind. Actually here there is no this option. That means we are not using bind. We are using, suppose this, what is this refers to? Here again problem is there. Why? Because generally event arguments are there now. What are the event arguments we are having? This refers to event argument. You already know JavaScript have two event arguments. One is event, another one this. This refers to, here it have an issue. Is it referring to current class or current object? Current element. Because you know in JavaScript two arguments are there. This, another one, event. In that case, this becomes an issue. So that is, we will see how it will manage that. But majority everywhere we have to follow only two techniques actually. That means either you bind, so directly here age change dot what bind, bind with what this. That means this will refer to, bind refers to the current class, right? All its arguments, everything are same. So that means there is no point. So you can use all event arguments in the same way how you defined in a function component. You can use all the event arguments in the same way how you defined in the function components. So everything same. That means it uses what? So handle name, so E, and you know what they can access. What they can access here. So E dot client X. So E dot target dot ID name value emirate. Here client X key code, which all this. What are the events it is going to manage? So all these are same, there is no change. And without bind method, how you can do? Without bind method, how we can do is we can make it return, but that's not every time. So we can create a function, and this function can return this dot what handle change. That means this is the technique of returning. Actually, what is the technique of returning is it will able to handle the value. So it is not showing any error, but how do we collect and use? We will see that. That's another point you will see. That's without bind also it is possible. So if anyone asks like another question is, can we configure event handlers without bind method? That is the question. So yes, answer is yes. So you have to configure a function that returns current method current memory to the current class. That's what we can do.
बेटा है वो हाँ कितना है
Yes, you have to configure a function that returns the current method memory to the current class so that it can use that memory.
तो
So here, that means this is the function. This function is what?
कम्मा रहेगा तब
This method is returned through a function. You know already what is meant by return, right? Already in functions you learn JavaScript functions. So when you are writing a function and a function name, and here we are using the word return, right? And you are returning some value. What is the meaning of this return? Technically, the meaning of return is not returning value. It is not meaning returning value. It is a jump statement. How you call a jump statement returning value? That means now what is happening is, without return, what will happen actually? Without return, you see this is a block. That means the memory allocated for a function, and it will perform the functionality. And when it reaches here, the memory ends. The memory allocated for a function is destroyed automatically when the function ends. Return is a jump statement, and anything after return you write, it is not reachable to compiler. That's a general concept. Anything after the word return is not reachable to compiler. Why before ending you are stopping the compiler? Before ending a function, why you are stopping a compiler? What will happen is, when it reaches here, what will happen? When it reaches here, memory discards. That means here the memory allocated, and here the memory discards. If anybody asked what is the meaning of void, means void is to discard the memory. Any technical definition about void is, in software programming, void is to discard the memory, not no return value. That's what generally learners give a definition. What is void means no return. It is not about return, it is about memory discarding or not. Void is always will discard the memory, but before it discards the memory, you are terminating. Return is a jump statement. Then what happens is, memory of this function is alive even after this return. That means what happens is, this functionality done, memory is not destroyed, memory is still alive. Then what happens? This memory will be used to handle this value. That means the function memory is used to handle the value. That means now function will act as a function as well as a variable. That means it will perform the functionality and it will store the result. How a function keeps its memory alive? Because before it discards, we are terminating. So this is the technique happening behind the word return. Actually, return is not returning a value. Return is the ordinary jump statement. It is a jump statement that discards before the memory is discarded, that stops before memory is discarded, so the memory is still available. That means now what happens is this is going to return the memory of method to the current class. If it is going to return the memory, this is a function returning. If it is returning the memory to the current class, here we are adding David some name, adding age, it should use that age. We will make it use. Here it is not showing on change, because on change we have to collect the value. Now we are not collecting the value, because when you write like this, here we are passing event arguments. Remember, these event arguments are not passed now. Then how it will accept? Event arguments we have to pass. How do you pass event argument? Then you pass the event argument by using e. E refers to what? E refers to event argument. So here we are passing the event argument. You see, E is not defined. How do you pass the event argument? This is the actual value now. We discussed events now, various. How do you pass the event argument? Can I return here? No. Can we define there? That means here we can use E. What is that E? Is it referring to all the events? That means here we are configuring that E. That means it will work. Already I showed you this in events handling. In event handling already we discussed that. No, how do we pass custom arguments? How do we pass default arguments? We learned detailedly about that. That means if you can implement that, then it will solve the problem. So am I using any bind method now? No, there is no bind. So without bind we can make it to use the state. Without bind, how we can make it the state? That means what you can do is you can configure a function that returns the current method memory, and this memory will be used by current class. In that case, automatically the state configured for current class is accessible to this method. So this is a very experience level question. Without bind, how you will do? Because everyone who learns React class components, he knows majority how we can do with a bind. Means he knows only one point, that every time we have to bind. And majority of all class related examples, if you see, there will be configuring with the bind in constructor or bind in the method level. But without bind, we can manage in different occasions. Then we have to use this technique. If you are doing that, you have to make sure that you are passing the value. That means you configure a formal parameter. This refers to event. We pass this event as an actual value. That event is collected here and it can access all the details. So that is the approach we need to follow. So how this is possible? So syntactically we write like this. So we have a input, type is text, and on change is equal to, we need to write a function. This function should use this dot handle some name, and it should use that event and return it. That's how you define without bind. Without bind, how you are configuring. E refers to event argument. That means it defines both event details as well as object details, element related details. So this already I showed in a event concept. If you can implement this, then you can do without the bind. Right. So these are various techniques. I will copy this example. Let me copy this example. This is register user dot what JSX. This is register user dot JSX. Now you have a complete idea on state and idea on how do we work with the events. Now we can recreate all our examples into this. That means whatever function related you done. One more you learned extra there, that is properties.
गरम करके लाओ ना जरा
That means how do we create a component
जरा पानी दो
which can be reused with a different kind of
और है तो
customized data. We learned about component properties. How about properties here? Because their properties are passed
हैं
while
रफत पड़ा दी
calling the function parameters. Am I right? Now here it is not a function. If it is not a function, then what we have to do? So how do we access?
खुला होगा
So that means how do we access those parameters and how do we use them? That means it is not a function. Then what about properties? How do we define the properties? Where to define the properties? Now, if it is not a function, then where to define the properties? Let's go to the base component. If you see the base component, usually here property, arguments in a class are passed at the time of creating an instance of class. Into the constructor, you have to pass the arguments. Constructor can be parameterized, right? At the time of creating an object, you can pass those parameters. You observe here, right click and go to definition. This is React component. And actually React component is coming from an interface. It is coming from an interface. This is coming from an interface. And it is using a class component. You observe here, component have a P parameter. Later you will understand this because it is written in TypeScript. Entire React library is built with TypeScript. If React library is built with TypeScript, if you know TypeScript, then you can easily manage, right? You learn, means you can build the libraries also. I will show you. Now you can see that this P refers to the properties, S refers to the state. That means every component is inbuilt having two basic points, the property and the state. It is having the property and the state. When you want to create a component, you need the properties. Generally what we do here, I will go to another location and a new folder. We will say, suppose we say some toolbar, and we will add a new file. So toolbar.jsx. We need to create a component which can be reusable. That means what we are doing, export class component. Class component is using, suppose toolbar. Toolbar is extending React dot component, and this is having a constructor, and this constructor is configuring the properties. We are calling the super constructor, and here this constructor is expecting defined with the properties, and we need a method. What is the method? Render. This render method have to return it should return the render method, right? A render method, this render method have to return a markup. Okay. In this, we want to use the properties. Properties is like an object. That means suppose here we put a nav and a heading, and here we are using the props. That means this dot props dot title something. That means this toolbar is expecting a title. That means we put a class bg dark text white padding 2 something like this, and I want to use this toolbar in our component. How do we use that? That means how we can access and use in our component. Here we want to use it, that register component at the top. We want to use the toolbar, then we have to access toolbar and import it. It is expecting a property called what? Title. Title is like some shopping, so shopping, and you see here it is working same. Only the point is the properties are passed into the construct, and those properties are used directly. Even you don't pass the property here, see, in the constructor. So in the toolbar constructor, I am not passing the properties. Suppose I am not configuring the properties, and you see here it is working, because you saw the React component inbuilt configures properties, and you are extending them. Then you don't need to configure them again. You can directly use, because it's extending the base class. Now base class is having already properties. You can directly use the properties and configure this dot props. That means how do you configure the properties? The properties are configured directly by using this dot props. That means a component related properties. Component can use properties by using this dot props derived from base component class. Base component class, and all concepts are same. This props is what type? This dot props is what type? Is an object type. Object type means it contains keys. Those keys are used as properties. That means you created a grid, you created some nav bars and all. Everything you can design in the same way. There in function components, we pass them as parameters. In class components, we just access as props, and no need to declare anywhere. So this is an example for nav bar. This is toolbar. Toolbar.jsx. That is the example how we use. Just I am giving that here. Rest of design you know already how to create such. So all concepts for handling are similar. Now what about third parties? You should be very careful, because all third parties that you have used may not be suitable for class components. Some third parties are designed for functions. So you have to go to the libraries and verify whether they have the proper support for class. Otherwise issues will come. So majority all third parties have. Few are not supported with class, so you have to carefully implement them. Your Axios will work in the same way. Your other Ajax calls will work in the same way. Everything is same. Formic, same. Right? All the features will work in the same. Now we can create one example using the class components. But for before that, we need to learn one more extra is every class component have a life cycle. We call them as component life cycle. What is this component life cycle? What are the phases of component? That we will see. Tomorrow we'll do that. Right, in tomorrow's session, we are going to learn about component life cycle hooks. React hooks are different. Life cycle hooks are different. So what are these life cycle hooks? Tomorrow we'll see that. Okay, right.